name is Patrick Brothers. I know many of you as founder and CEO of Holland IQ. Recently, Holland IQ was acquired by QS. You might know QS as the University Rankings organization, now focusing on innovation and skills around the world as well. I am going to power through 20 minutes of data-packed insights on India and the global skills economy. We've spent a lot of time today focusing on specific issues. I'm going to zoom out and see the big picture. We're going to look at India and the world in 2050. I'm going to look at population and education here in India, the talent and skills pipeline, and then finally the impact of artificial intelligence here in India as well. Spoiler alert, these are the three big key takeaways. This is a complete reverse order presentation. First up, India will likely once again be the world's largest economy. And I'm going to share what I mean about that, but that is something that is becoming clearer and clearer. India will award more than 150 million post-secondary credentials in the next 25 years. That's nearly 50 million more credentials than the prior 25 years. Finally, based on today's labour force here in India, there's around 100 million jobs that are at a high or very high risk of automation, and around 50 million jobs that stand to gain from augmentation from artificial intelligence. Show your workings, you say? Let's jump in and have a look at the data. India and the world in 2050. This is some popular research on the share of global GDP going back 2,000 years. India is in green. On the left-hand side, you can see there, according to this very well-cited and researched academic work, India made up just short of 50% of global GDP over 2,000 years ago. There are some that contest this. It's very hard to piece together. There weren't any spreadsheets back 2,000 years ago, that's for sure. But this is very well-cited work. And you can see some of the inflection points over time that really compressed India's share of global GDP. And as we look out to 2023 today, we see India again expanding and taking more of the world's GDP. This is some fuzzy lines on the y-axis showing GDP growth rate over time. India in green again, China in red, the US in blue, and some of our larger European peers in orange here as well. For those who studied back in the 1970s, India was not a great place from a GDP perspective. Very, very difficult time. But as we see that green line over time, especially if you trace back the last 25 years, India has consistently doubled US GDP growth rate. And look at China there as well. You'd be forgiven reading the newspapers for China being negative and collapsing. It's not. And if you look here on the right-hand side, and our forecasts are pretty much the same as Goldman Sachs and IMF and all of the other leading economists, this is India, way ahead of the rest of the world. This is China, this is the US, and these are our European peers as well. This is IMF forecasts, Holland IQ forecasts, Goldman Sachs forecasts. This is growth as we see it in the global economy today. When we look at our own work, we look at, from a ranking perspective, the size of these economies. Back 2024, you see US number 1, China number 2, India is in blue at number 5. As we roll forward, and we're not too dissimilar to some of those peers about how we see the global economy evolving. There's no crazy assumptions in here. This is like a momentum case as we see the world rolling forward. We expect towards the end of this century, India to be the largest economy. Hence our insight that we expect, save any crazy changes, and I think we can bet on one or two of those in the next 25 to 50 years. India is in a very, very strong global position. There's 8 shifts that we think about when we think about India and we think about the rest of the world. Power shifts, geopolitical shifts. India is in a fascinating position, an enviable position for some geopolitical analysts, friends with nearly everybody at the moment. Of course, all the usual suspects, friends with the US, friends with China, friends with Russia, friends with the UK. India has a strong geopolitical position. Economic shifts, of course, resource shifts, critical minerals, energy shifts, solar, wind, oil and gas, you name it. Demographic shifts we're going to double click into. Urban shifts, not always good. Often we talk about urbanization, rising GDP per capita. In India, we also see urban slums, and we see this in many developing parts of the world. Urbanization is also pushing huge populations together and creating its own challenges. Technology shifts, dare I mention the two-letter acronym, and behavioral shifts, whether that's the decline in trust, social media, just less behavior that's positive and helpful in the world due to some of these changing forces. So let's double click into population and education. This is the share of the global working age population. South Asia, in that pinky color at the top, represents 1 in 4 working age people on Earth. So 1 in 4 of the global potential labor force are here in South Asia. East Asia is dropping. You can see them in blue. They are dropping because of demographics, dropping to about 1 in 5 as we roll out through the next generation and a bit. Africa is a continent, India is a country, but we like to compare them sometimes. Africa, however, is on the rise, and it'll catch up with South Asia over that period in terms of working age population. This is global population on the left. It still blows my mind every time I see this chart. That's 1950, 2.5 billion of us in the world, just like a SpaceX rocket ship. It is actually unbelievable looking at that chart even just now. Our global population kind of trying to reach 10 billion, but probably not, and starting to decline through the second half of this century as well. You see on the right-hand side the share of India, which is it's pretty stable actually. I mean, it's the global population which is rocketing. India's holding that share, which you can see a really strong share through the period that we're in now, declining a little bit, but that's because it's Africa's time in the second half of this century. Now, let's double click. On the left-hand side are colors representing age bands. Blue is 0 to 19, and the one I want to talk about first. If you're close enough, you'll see this shaded line, which represents about now, 2025. Blue is already in decline. Over the next generation, India will lose 80 million people in this age bracket. It's already declining massively. So when we talk about a youth population in India, we're already post-peak. When we look at the 20 to 39-year-old bracket, it will peak over the next 3 to 5 years. And population stats in this age group, we're not talking about fertility. We already know these people, they exist, they're here on Earth, mortality rates, so this is very, very certain. And then we start to look at the other end, so that red line is 60 to 80, purple is 80 plus. Look at those lines. They are the lines that are booming. Those lines are extraordinary over time. This little aqua line down the bottom doesn't really register against an Indian scale that reaches 500 million on the y-axis, but according to UN population stats, there'll be 10 million 100-plus-year-olds here in India at the end of this century. That is a frightening statistic. All right, let's really double click now into 10 to 14-year-olds. So we're obviously at a certain stage in school. On the x-axis here, this is today. There are about 120 million 10 to 14-year-olds here in India. We have to go back to China, 80 million plus 10 to 14-year-olds in China. We have to take quite a walk to get to our next closest, 20 million-ish, Nigeria, Pakistan, USA, Indonesia. If you're below this white line, your 10 to 14-year-old population is shrinking. If you're above this line, your 10 to 14-year-old population is growing. And that is why these little blue bubbles here in Africa is building this huge Africa wave. But it's still India's time. India is still out in front, other than the challenge of educating these 120 million 10 to 14-year-olds. Let's look at India's total population, 1.4 billion, 1.5 billion. You've got to love it when you round a population to the nearest 100 million. This is all 1.4 billion of India's population. 22% of India's population is not literate. 17% have achieved literacy, or their highest level of educational attainment is primary school. 20% have achieved middle school. So that's not 20% in middle school, that's 20% of everyone, and their highest level of educational attainment was middle school. 14% for secondary. So I'm standing here, this is how much of India, their highest level of educational attainment is secondary. And in India's classification, they have a higher secondary bucket, a diploma, graduate, and postgraduate. And so this is perhaps one of the biggest challenges for India is education for this part of the graph. Of course, we're spending a lot of time focusing on our friends and colleagues who are privileged enough to be up here, but the real opportunity for India, and we'll look at it now, is to the left. I've simplified on the left-hand side the number that India's population has, as it's grown over time, coloured again by the highest level of educational attainment. So this means that this is how much of the population, their highest level of educational attainment was K-12. This is the percentage of India's population whose highest level of educational attainment was post-secondary. And this is where we get our projection that we saw India credential or award, post-secondary credentials. I'm purposefully being broad in that nomenclature. 37 million in the 25 years to 2000, 100 million credentials in the last 25 years, and 158 million in the next 25 years as well. So huge growth in terms of that credentialing, and again, I'm being purposefully broad in that definition. So let's now move to talent. I want to start globally. 3.4 billion people in the global labour force. 3.4 billion in the global labour force. There's people who are working. The question that we're going to look at in this chart is it really true that 50% of jobs just started yesterday or will be redundant next year or the year after? And so what we did is we took the 3.4 billion people, we classified them into our occupation taxonomy of 2,000 occupations, and then we looked at when did that occupation become mainstream? When did that occupation really break through to being just a standard, normal job? So up to here, about 20% of the jobs today, or people employed in jobs today, are in jobs that were mainstream before 1940. These are people working in agriculture, people working in some elements of manufacturing, people who are in jobs that existed a very, very, very long time ago. Up to 70% as we move our way through World War II, Industrial Revolution, we start to see 70% of us who are in jobs that were mainstreamed by around 1960. And then we roll this methodology forward again. Of course, if you're in one of these jobs, you're a cybersecurity analyst, or you're a mobile phone developer, or you're doing something that just definitely did not exist before 2000. But that is the share of those jobs. 50% of jobs are not going to be redundant 10 years from now if 98% of jobs were mainstream before the century turned here as well. What will change is skills. I've no doubt that all of these people in these jobs are using different skills, working on different machinery, using different methods. I mean, not always, definitely in agriculture for sure, but more often than not. We look at 6 main thematics when we think about the global economy at Holland IQ and now at QS. People, planet, the built environment, tech, funding, and consumer. We drill that down, well, that's a bit uglier than it's meant to be, into a bunch of layers. So people into education and healthcare, planet into environment, energy and resources, the built environment into infrastructure and transport. And we drill that down again, and we drill that down again, and we drill that down to 2,000 occupations. And that's the level of classification when we're talking about this analysis that we're doing. When we look at India's workforce, we see about 600 million people in India's workforce. And when we classify that workforce according to these classifications, this is kind of roughly how we see them. This is education, this is healthcare, this is the environment, energy and infrastructure, technology, defense and space, finance, government, business and consumer. And again, you need to be really careful for those who are India pros or are from India. The word retail means something really different in parts of India than it might in parts of the US, for example. Something really, really different. So we need to be a little bit careful there. India has a massive upskilling potential. Why? Because only 55% of the working age population are in the labour force. Only 55% of the working age population are in the labour force. Look at UAE, UK, China, 75-ish%. Imagine if we could get this number up. Imagine if we could upskill and reskill more Indians to push this number up, to have higher participation. You all know this so much better than I do and my peers who didn't grow up here in India. But when we look at government statistics and we use the word that someone's part of the labour force, we also need to be really careful about how we interpret that. According to government statistics, 38% of the workforce are self-employed. 38% of the workforce here are self-employed. You can see that number growing in the second category. Nearly 20% are called household jobs. That's adults in the house who are probably in healthcare or should be in healthcare or probably in all sorts of different, other classifications. Regular wages only makes up about 20% of that labour force here in India. And casual labour, again, this category, and this category, others might pull part of those into an informal labour market here as well. But so we also need to be really careful when we're looking at these statistics about how we feel. Labour productivity is the output, it's the part of GDP that we're building per hour worked of individual. If you've worked in economics or development before, there's a measure called PPP, which is purchase price parity, which tries to do apples and apples on currencies and on purchasing power. So if you're in Singapore, every hour of output worked is about $100 contribution to GDP. If you're in India, every hour is just above $10 as well. Huge potential on the value, but also it's small, but this is an enormous slope and hopefully just keeps getting steeper, and will get steeper if our efforts in upskilling and reskilling really create impact here. That's another big opportunity. So big lever one, more people from the working age bracket in the workforce. Lever number two, for every hour that they work, they're contributing more and earning more themselves for the country and for their families. When we look across India, we do see some incredible work. We do see incredible work at graduating, really large supplies of fresh graduates in engineering, arts and science. This is the work that is contributing to that massive rise in post-secondary credentials that we've seen. 100 million-ish in the last 25 years, 150 million-ish in the next 25 years as well. If I double click into a topic like STEM and international education, I'm sure many of you are aware, India in many parts of the world has overtaken China in terms of the number of international students who are leaving India to study in other parts of the world. This is the US market, and this is every one of the top source countries to the US market. What's interesting is how many in the makeup of those countries. So India is a real outlier in that 90% of students who leave India to study abroad are studying STEM. And 80% of those students are postgraduates, which if you look at the colors across here, there's a huge, huge outlier to everybody else. It's just so different to every other market. Massive volumes of post-secondary STEM graduates who are leaving India to study abroad as well. Look how different that is to, say, Germany, where it's kind of the opposite in terms of the weighting of non-STEM, in terms of undergrad and postgraduate as well. And that's why, and you'll hear this statistic a lot, 1 in 3 global STEM graduates are from India, whether that's domestically here or studying abroad. All right, we're closing out. India meets artificial intelligence. I want to double click on those stats I shared at the front in terms of augmentation and automation. Of course, we actually have no clue how AI is going to impact the future yet. I mean, from Monday to Friday, your view could change completely on the latest ChatGPT or DeepSeek release, and whether it's just a better search engine or whether it's just going to completely replace all of us. You'd be a brave person to think that you know the answer to that, and so we think about scenarios. We think about scenarios that are modeling very, very high levels of automation and low levels of augmentation, and scenarios the complete opposite, which is actually, it's just a huge augmentation opportunity. Good luck replacing humans in the next 100 years. So we need to think really, really broadly about those scenarios. To do that scenario work, of course, we start with the 600 million people here in India, and we look at what occupations they're in, because the level of augmentation and automation will differ massively whether you are working in agriculture in a remote part of India or whether you're working in finance in Bombay. Obviously, hugely different assumptions about the impact of artificial intelligence. So we need to start with that set there. Giving you the answer first again, and we'll double click into a bit of detail. When we do an assessment across those 600 million jobs, we see a spread of the probability of the risk of automation for those jobs. And so this is the percentage of jobs. 9% of jobs here in India we think have a very low risk of automation. Whereas 1% of jobs here we think have a very high risk of automation. 15% have a high percentage of automation. So when we apply those across those 600 million jobs in all those different patterns, we get about 100 million jobs that have a high or very high risk of automation. Again, it's based on the job and it's based on the skills. Now when we look at augmentation, we do the same level of analysis. We see here 7% have a high potential for augmentation. 1% have a very high potential for augmentation. Of course, we don't really know whether that's 1 times, 2 times, 10 times augmentation, but again, it's kind of looking at the pattern of the job as well. That's not an amazing equation. 100 million at risk in terms of automation, 50 million in terms of augmentation, but it's something we want to keep an eye on as we learn more about how artificial intelligence might impact these areas. And what we do is work with governments to help mitigate risk around this side, and try and help move populations into upskilling and reskilling pathways that will take them into areas that are more likely to have augmentation as part of the next wave in the impact of AI. Lots of data crunching and analysis here. You can see on the left-hand side, for example, when we take those 600 million jobs, where they land in terms of their automation risk. And you can see the industries here, which is what I find the most interesting. Of course, it makes sense that agriculture, for the most part, would have a low or very low probability of automation, but you can still see there's agriculture jobs in all of those stacks there. And they're different agriculture jobs that might be replaced with satellite telemetry or automation of farming machinery and things like that. We do the same level of analysis on augmentation. Again, same kind of spread. Of course, the environmental agriculture is just so big, such a big share of jobs here. It gives India a very interesting profile, but also the business and consumer roles. Again, careful about those labels and how we'll see that impact as well. Of course, when we double click into tech itself, it's exciting. It's exciting to be here in India. It's exciting to see the tech hubs that have been developing for actually quite a long time. If you're not from India and you've been coming to India like me for the last 25 years and working here as well, you start to become more familiar with some of these hubs as well. Really interestingly, on the left-hand side, these are stats that are well cited across the market. We talk about a 600 million labour force. The tech talent across India is really only sized at about 6 million right now, and you can see the distribution there between kind of core technology talent, so that's people who are coding, people who are writing algorithms, people who are building software, digital tech talent, which is a little bit closer to some of the kind of support functions, slightly less technical, still very digitally focused, and then non-tech talent that is part of that tech ecosystem, still employed within the tech community, definitely not writing code, lower technical jobs as well across the market. So I'm going to stop there. I know that was a whole lot of information in a very, very short period of time, but like you, I've been kind of zooming in through the day on very specific issues. I wanted to kind of zoom out, and before we connect over a drink this evening, share some insights on what we're finding about India. Thank you so much for your time. Look forward to meeting you all over the next day or so. Cheers.